The sun was beginning to set over suburban Atlanta, casting long shadows over the Williams' quiet, peaceful home. But the tranquility was about to be shattered forever. When two frightened children knocked on their door asking for help, Nancy and Henry Williams had no idea that this simple act of kindness would lead them down a path of painful revelations, family betrayals and heartbreak. What they didn't know was that their lives were about to change as their pasts came rushing back with a vengeance. Nancy Williams had spent over 50 years alongside her husband, Henry. Their life had been simple, built on routines, quiet conversations, and the occasional laughter shared during their slow evenings. The children had grown up and moved on, leaving the couple to enjoy a life of solitude. Their home, a modest two-story house on the outskirts of Atlanta, was filled with memories of raising their family. The walls seemed to whisper with the echoes of days long gone. It was a peaceful existence, but also one that was slowly becoming empty. Nancy's hair, once a rich auburn, was now a soft gray, her face lined with the wisdom of the years. Henry, too, had aged gracefully, though the weight of time had left its mark on his once strong frame. Their children, Ruth and Michael, had left the nest long ago, and they rarely heard from them now. Occasionally there would be a phone call, a holiday card, but the connection was fraying. On this particular afternoon, Nancy had just finished baking a batch of cookies when the doorbell rang. She wiped her hands on her apron and walked over, assuming it was one of the neighbors. But when she opened the door, her heart nearly stopped. Standing on her porch were two children, one girl and one boy, both around 8 years old. They had big, dark eyes that seemed too old for their small faces, and their clothes were ragged, their bodies thin and frail. The girl, the older of the two by a few minutes, stepped forward first, her voice trembling as she spoke. "Mom, could you help us? We've been left outside. Our mom and dad, they said they couldn't take care of us anymore. They just left." Nancy's breath caught in her throat. The words hit her like a wave of cold water. "Where are your parents now?" she asked. Her voice barely above a whisper. "They just disappeared. They left us on the street. We don't know where they went," the girl answered, her voice cracking. The boy, silent until now, clutched his sister's hand tightly, his gaze shifting nervously around the quiet street. Nancy's heart ached. Without a second thought, she stepped aside to let them in. "Come inside, you're safe now," she said, her voice steady despite the rising panic inside her. Henry, who had been sitting in his favorite armchair, looked up from his book in confusion as Nancy ushered the children in. "What's going on?" "Nancy?" he asked, his voice thick with the calm he always carried. They're lost, Henry," Nancy said, her voice shaking slightly. "Their parents left them on the street." Henry stood up, his expression turning from one of mild confusion to deep concern. He looked at the two children, Jada and Jalen, as they introduced themselves, and his heart softened. They were clearly terrified, their bodies trembling from a mix of hunger and fear. Without a word, he moved to the kitchen to prepare something warm for them to eat. The evening passed quietly, with Nancy and Henry trying to make the children feel at home. As they ate, Jada and Jalen spoke little, their words coming out in hesitant, fractured sentences. But as the night grew darker, they began to open up, telling Nancy and Henry about their parents, Ruth and Michael. "Our mum, she said she couldn't keep us anymore. She said we were too much to handle," Jada explained softly, avoiding Nancy's gaze. "She said we should stay out of her way, that we shouldn't be around anymore." Nancy felt her chest tighten. "What about your dad? Where is he?" she asked, though she already had a sinking feeling she knew the answer. "He's gone. He left. After he fought with Mom, he hasn't come back." Henry froze in the kitchen, his hands stilling as he listened. His heart sank into his stomach. The names Ruth and Michael, his own children, felt foreign, like a distant memory of a time when he believed they had everything figured out. They had always seemed like a solid family, the kind of family that would never fall apart. But hearing the fear in these children's voices, the trauma they carried shattered that illusion. Nancy's hands trembled as she set the table, trying to hold herself together. She had raised Ruth, her only daughter, with love, with discipline, with care. How could this be happening? How could Ruth and Michael, her own flesh and blood, have abandoned these children? "Why did they leave you?" Nancy asked, her voice barely audible as she stared at the two children. Jalen looked up at her, his eyes wide with confusion. "We don't know. They just didn't want us anymore." The words hung in the air, thick and heavy. A cold chill passed through Nancy as she looked at the two children, their faces so innocent yet filled with the heavy burden of neglect and abandonment. She wanted to scream at Ruth. How could she have done this? How could she leave her own children to fend for themselves? Jada and Jalen stayed the night, and as Nancy tucked them into bed, she felt an overwhelming sense of responsibility wash over her. They were her grandchildren, her flesh and blood, though neither of them knew that yet, and they needed her. The next morning, Nancy and Henry discussed the situation quietly, away from the children. Nancy felt a rising dread in her chest. She didn't want to face the reality that their daughter, Ruth, had done something unforgivable. But the more she thought about it, the more it became clear. The children's words, their trauma, couldn't be ignored. Something was terribly wrong with Ruth. Henry was silent, his face drawn and weary. He had always been the protective father, the one who defended his children no matter what. But now, as he listened to Nancy's concerns, he couldn't deny the growing suspicion that something had gone terribly wrong. They couldn't just ignore this. They couldn't just send these children back. "Do you think we should call Ruth?" Henry finally asked, his voice quiet but edged with fear. Nancy shook her head, her mind reeling with the possibilities. "I don't know, but we can't just let them go back, not after what they've been through." The reality of their situation was sinking in. They weren't just helping two lost children. They were about to face a truth that would tear their family apart. The doorbell rang again, breaking the heavy silence. Nancy's heart skipped a beat. She knew without a doubt who it was, and she wasn't ready for what was about to happen, but she had no choice. The past was knocking on her door. The sound of the doorbell echoed through the house, each chime like a countdown to a moment of reckoning. Nancy's breath caught in her chest. She stood frozen, staring at the front door, her hands trembling ever so slightly. Henry was already moving toward it, his face tight with the same nervous tension that had settled in Nancy's stomach. The children, Jada and Jalen, were sitting on the couch, their eyes wide and innocent, unaware of the storm that was about to hit. Nancy turned toward them, trying to smile, but the gesture felt forced. "Stay here for a moment, okay?" she said softly, her voice steady despite the tightness in her throat. The kids nodded, but there was a flicker of fear in their eyes. They could sense the unease in the air, the electricity before a storm. Henry reached the door and opened it. Standing there was Ruth. Nancy's heart sank at the sight of her daughter. Ruth looked different, more worn down than the last time Nancy had seen her, a few months ago. Her eyes were hollow, and her posture slumped as though the weight of something heavy hung over her. Nancy could barely suppress a gasp. Ruth's long, tangled hair was unkempt, and her clothes were disheveled. But what struck Nancy the most was the way Ruth stood at the threshold. There was no apology, no sign of shame or remorse, just a tense, exhausted woman who had come to take what she had abandoned. Ruth didn't even wait for a greeting. "Where are they?" she demanded, her voice flat but urgent. "Where are my kids?" Nancy felt the blood drain from her face. She could hardly believe what was happening. This wasn't her daughter. This wasn't the Ruth she had raised. This woman standing before her was a stranger, someone who had caused so much damage, and yet still dared to act entitled. Nancy tried to steady her voice as she spoke. "They're inside, Ruth," she said, trying to keep calm, but the words came out colder than she intended. "But I need to talk to you first." Henry stepped forward, his face hardening. "Ruth, we need to understand what's going on here. Why did you abandon them? Why did you leave your own children out on the street?" Ruth flinched, but she quickly masked it with a bitter laugh. "Oh, so now you're both going to play the concerned grandparents? Where were you when they needed help, huh?" Her words dripped with resentment. Nancy felt the sting of her daughter's words, but there was something else behind them, something darker, something that made her feel more afraid than she had in a long time. "Ruth?" Nancy's voice trembled now, a mix of hurt and confusion. "You didn't just leave them on the street. You abandoned them for good. They've been asking why you didn't want them anymore. They've been asking why their father never came back. You can't just come here, demanding them back without explaining anything." Ruth's eyes flickered for a moment. There was something there, an unease that was quickly buried. She stepped into the house without invitation, her face hardening as she walked past her parents. "I don't have to explain myself to you, Mum. I'm their mother, and I'm here to take them home." Henry slammed the door shut behind her with an audible thud. His jaw was clenched, his hands balled into fists at his sides. Nancy followed Ruth into the living room, where the kids were still sitting, their eyes wide with uncertainty. Ruth's gaze landed on Jada and Jalen, and for the first time, Nancy saw a flicker of something other than anger, something that almost looked like guilt, but it was fleeting. "You're going to come home now," Ruth said to the children, her voice commanding, her tone the same as when she used to order them around as kids. "I've got everything figured out. I was just going through some stuff, but it's all better now." Jada stood up slowly, her hand clutching Jalen's. She looked to her grandmother first, then to her mother. "You said we were too much to handle. You said you didn't want us. Why are you here now?" Ruth's face twitched and she glanced away. "I didn't say that," she snapped, but her voice wavered, betraying the lie. "You two, you're fine. Everything's fine now." But the children weren't convinced. Jalen stepped forward, his voice barely a whisper. "Mum, where's Dad?" Ruth stiffened, her eyes darting away from her son. The silence that followed felt suffocating, and Nancy could feel the knot in her chest tighten with every passing second. She knew the truth. Ruth had never truly cared for her children, but hearing it from the children themselves, hearing their raw confusion, it was unbearable. "I don't know where your father is, Jalen," Ruth said finally, her voice almost too soft, as if she was afraid the words would reveal something she wasn't ready to admit. He left. I don't know, but I'm here now. That's what matters." The room seemed to hold its breath. Nancy couldn't contain herself anymore. "Don't lie to them, Ruth," she said, her voice breaking as she stepped forward. "Don't you dare lie to them. You didn't just lose him, you killed him, didn't you?" The words hung in the air like a poison, suffocating everyone in the room. Ruth froze, her eyes widening, and for a split second, Nancy saw her daughter's mask crack. But Ruth quickly regained her composure, her eyes flashing with anger. "Shut up," Ruth hissed, her voice low and dangerous. "You don't know anything." "I know enough," Nancy spat back, her voice trembling with fury. "I know that you're responsible for everything that's happened to them. You killed Michael, and now you're trying to steal them back after everything you've done." Ruth's face twisted with something Nancy couldn't quite place. Shame, perhaps, or regret, but it disappeared as quickly as it had come. "You don't know what you're talking about, Mom. You're crazy." Henry, who had been silent until now, spoke up. "Ruth, what have you done?" Ruth's eyes narrowed. "It's none of your business." Nancy could see the desperation in her daughter's eyes. Ruth wasn't just angry, she was terrified, and she was covering up something much darker than anyone could imagine. "Leave them alone, Ruth," Nancy demanded, her voice rising with authority. "These children are staying here and you're not taking them. Not now, not ever." Ruth took a deep breath, and for a moment, the room was silent. Then, with a flick of her wrist, she turned to leave, but not before throwing one last look at the children. "This isn't over. You'll regret this." As the door slammed behind her, the tension in the room snapped. Nancy and Henry stood in the living room, their hearts pounding. "Do you think she really—" Henry started, his voice trailing off. Nancy didn't need to answer. She already knew. The truth was unfolding in front of them. Piece by painful piece, the storm had arrived, and there was no going back. The air in the Williams home felt thick with unspoken words after Ruth's visit. Nancy sat at the kitchen table, her hands pressed together, fingers intertwined tightly, as if she were trying to hold herself together. The emotions coursing through her, anger, confusion, betrayal, had left her shaken. Henry, pacing slowly in the living room, kept stealing glances at the children, who were still huddled together on the couch, their eyes wide with uncertainty. Jada and Jalen had barely spoken since Ruth left, their faces a mask of quiet fear, as though they were too afraid to process the storm they had just witnessed. Nancy could feel their silence, could feel their fear deep in her bones. She had to do something, had to say something to make them feel safe again. "Come here, sweethearts," Nancy called gently, her voice soft but firm. She reached out a hand, and both children hesitated before slowly walking over. Jalen, with his small frame, perched on the edge of the couch, while Jada stayed close behind him. Nancy pulled both of them into a warm embrace, their fragile little bodies trembling against her. "I know that was hard," Nancy whispered, pressing her cheek to Jada's head. "But you're safe here. We're going to take care of you no matter what." Jada's body stiffened in her arms, but then she seemed to collapse into Nancy's hug, the weight of her emotions too much to bear. A muffled sob escaped her lips, followed by Jalen's soft whimper. Nancy held them tighter, her heart breaking for these children who had already endured so much in their young lives. As the children cried quietly, Nancy's mind spun. Ruth's words echoed in her head. "I didn't do anything wrong." But Nancy knew the truth. She could feel it in her bones. Ruth wasn't the daughter she raised. The mother she had become was someone unrecognizable. Ruth's betrayal went deeper than Nancy could have imagined. And it wasn't just her actions. It was the devastation she had caused to these innocent children. Nancy wiped away a tear that had slid down her own cheek. She hadn't cried in years, but now she couldn't stop herself. Not just for the pain Ruth had caused, but for the anguish these two little ones were carrying with them. How could she have not seen it? How could she have missed all the signs of Ruth's unraveling? The question gnawed at her, refusing to let her rest. "Henry," Nancy called out softly, turning toward her husband, who was still pacing back and forth in the living room. "We need to know the truth about Michael." Henry stopped mid-step and turned to her, his face a mirror of confusion and guilt. "I know, Nancy, I know," he said quietly, his voice raw, "but I don't know how much of this I can handle. Ruth, she was always the one I protected. I didn't want to face what was happening with her. I didn't want to believe it. She was my little girl. For God's sake. Nancy stood up slowly, wiping her face with the back of her hand. She walked over to him, her steps slow and deliberate. Henry, we can't ignore it anymore. Ruth didn't just fall apart on her own. She had help. Someone helped her destroy their lives. Her voice cracked as she said the words. And it's time we figured out exactly what happened to Michael. Henry's face crumpled, the guilt written all over him. He sat down heavily on the couch, his hand running through his thinning hair. I don't know where to even start. I tried so hard to keep everything together, but I see now I was just enabling her. I thought I could fix it, but look what happened. Nancy sat beside him, placing a hand on his. She didn't speak for a moment, letting the weight of his words settle between them. Ruth's actions, their denial, the years they had spent pretending everything was fine. It all seemed so foolish now. Do you remember the night Michael disappeared? Nancy asked, her voice barely a whisper. Henry's face twisted, as though he were trying to push the memory away. He didn't answer right away, but Nancy could see the flicker of something, regret, fear, guilt, in his eyes. It's all a blur, he muttered. But I do remember Ruth saying, she said he left, that he just left. No explanation, but that didn't make sense. Michael loved his kids, he wouldn't just abandon them. Something happened that night, Nancy. Something more than she's telling us. Nancy's heart raced as her mind ran through the possibilities. Ruth's confession, her cryptic words about Michael leaving, had never felt right. But now, hearing Henry's doubt, hearing the cracks in his voice made everything fall into place. Ruth had covered up something, and whatever it was dark. We have to find out what really happened to Michael, Nancy said, her voice shaking with resolve. Not just for us, but for Jada and Jalen. They deserve the truth. Henry nodded, though his face looked haunted. He had spent so many years burying his doubts, burying his fears. But now, they were coming to the surface, and they were impossible to ignore. Nancy knew that confronting Ruth would not be easy. It would be painful, devastating even, but they couldn't keep living in the shadow of this lie. It was time to take action, to find out what had really happened to Michael, and to uncover the secrets Ruth had been hiding for so long. But she also knew one thing for sure. Whatever they discovered, it was going to change everything. Later that night, after the children had fallen asleep, Nancy sat alone at the kitchen table, the weight of the decision heavy on her shoulders. Her hands shook as she picked up the phone. She dialed a number she hadn't called in years, the number for the Atlanta Police Department. The ringing on the other end felt like a countdown. The truth was finally going to come out, but at what cost? As the phone picked up, Nancy's voice trembled as she spoke. I need to report something. My daughter, she's been hiding the truth about my son-in-law's disappearance. I think there's more to it than she's saying. The officer on the other end promised they would look into it, but Nancy knew this was just the beginning. The past had come rushing back, and there was no turning away from the path ahead. The door to their painful truth had been opened, and there was no way to close it again. The next morning came too quickly, its harsh light flooding through the blinds, and with it, the tension in the Williams household seemed to thicken. Nancy's mind spun with the decisions she had made the night before. The phone call to the police had felt like a step towards some kind of resolution, but now, as the sun crept higher in the sky, she began to feel the weight of what she had set in motion. The truth, whatever it was about to come crashing down on their family, and she wasn't sure they were ready. Jada and Jalen had woken early, their faces still streaked with the remnants of their tears from the previous night. They were quieter now, perhaps hoping that the world had somehow returned to normal. But Nancy could see the uncertainty in their eyes, the way they lingered in the doorway of the kitchen, unsure of where they truly belonged. Nancy tried to mask the fear she felt as she set out breakfast. Nothing too fancy, just scrambled eggs and toast. A small attempt to create a sense of comfort, but the silence in the room was suffocating. She wanted to ask them about the night before, to reassure them that they were safe, but the words stuck in her throat. How could she promise them safety when she didn't know what was coming next? Henry, still in his bathrobe, joined them at the table, his eyes tired and heavy. He sat down across from Jada and Jalen, offering them a strained smile, one that didn't quite reach his eyes. Nancy could tell he was fighting his own internal battle. He didn't know what to believe anymore, didn't know what was true, and that uncertainty had planted a seed of doubt in his heart. "We're going to find out what happened, kids," Henry said, his voice low and steady. "No one's going to hurt you again, not while we're here." Jada and Jalen exchanged a look, as if trying to understand what Henry meant, but neither of them spoke. The two of them had been through too much, and they seemed to know instinctively that words alone wouldn't solve their problems. They needed action. They needed answers. Nancy placed a plate of eggs in front of Jada and a glass of orange juice in front of Jalen. "Eat," she said softly. "We'll figure everything out, one step at a time." The children picked at their food, but the tension in the room was palpable. The minutes dragged by as Nancy glanced between her husband and the two children, her mind still reeling. She couldn't stop thinking about Ruth. She couldn't stop thinking about the horror of hearing her daughter's voice, cold and defensive, when she had confronted her. And yet, despite everything, Ruth's words still lingered in Nancy's mind. "You don't know anything." It was then that the knock on the door came. Nancy froze. Her heart skipped a beat and her stomach churned. It was too early for anyone to be visiting, and the sudden sound sent a ripple of anxiety through the room. Henry stood up first, his body tense. He had barely moved toward the door before Nancy was already behind him, her breath shallow with apprehension. When Henry opened the door, standing on the other side was a uniformed officer, a man with a no-nonsense look about him, his expression grim. "Good morning," the officer said, his voice professional but clipped. "I'm Detective Thompson with the Atlanta Police Department. We need to talk." Nancy's heart hammered in her chest as the officer stepped inside, his eyes scanning the room briefly before landing on her. There was something in his gaze, something that spoke of years of dealing with cases far darker than anything Nancy had ever imagined. "Detective, what's going on?" Henry asked, his voice low, his hand gripping the edge of the doorframe. "I'm afraid we've got some serious matters to discuss," Detective Thompson replied, his tone heavy with the weight of what was coming. "Is this the home of Ruth Williams and her children?" Nancy nodded, her mouth dry. "Yes, that's right. What's this about?" The officer took a breath before speaking again. "We've been looking into the disappearance of Michael Williams, your son-in-law." He paused, watching their reactions carefully. "It seems that there's more to this case than what was initially reported." Nancy felt a cold shiver crawl up her spine. Her thoughts raced. She had suspected something was wrong, something beyond Ruth's careless words. But hearing it out loud, hearing it from the police, was different. It made it real. "What do you mean?" Henry asked, his voice tight, his face pale. He had always protected Ruth, had always believed in her, even when it was clear she was slipping. But now, with the officer's presence, that illusion was starting to crumble. Detective Thompson pulled a folder from his briefcase and opened it, revealing photographs and documents that made Nancy's stomach lurch. The pictures were grainy, but they clearly showed Michael, bruised and bloodied, with a look of fear in his eyes. Nancy turned away, trying to shield herself from the image, but it was too late. The damage had already been done. "The investigation into Michael's disappearance was reopened last week," Thompson continued, his eyes never leaving Nancy. "We've uncovered some disturbing evidence that points to foul play. We believe Michael's death was not an accident. We're looking into the possibility of homicide." Nancy's world seemed to tilt on its axis. Homicide? Michael dead? She had always believed he had simply left, that he had abandoned his family as Ruth had claimed. But now, as the detective spoke, everything she had thought she knew was slipping through her fingers like sand. "Are you saying Ruth?" Henry's voice trailed off as he turned to Nancy, his expression one of complete disbelief. "We're still gathering evidence," Thompson said, cutting him off. "But we need to speak with Ruth as soon as possible. We need to know where she was the night Michael disappeared." Nancy's mind reeled. Ruth had told them nothing, and yet here was the truth, shattering their carefully constructed reality. She had to confront her daughter again, had to ask her the questions she was too afraid to ask before. "Where is Ruth now?" Detective Thompson asked, his voice authoritative. "Do you know where she is?" Nancy swallowed hard, her throat dry. "She came by here yesterday," she said, her voice faltering. She said she was taking the kids home, but I don't think that's what's really going on. She's hiding something." Thompson nodded grimly. "We're going to need your help, Mrs. Williams. If you know anything about what happened, we need you to tell us." Nancy looked over at Jada and Jalen, who were sitting quietly on the couch, their faces pale, their eyes full of confusion. They hadn't yet understood the gravity of the situation, but Nancy knew they would soon. "Of course," she said, her voice steadier now, as her resolve hardened. "I'll help you. I'll do whatever it takes." But deep down, Nancy felt a knot of dread tighten in her stomach. Ruth was slipping further and further away from the woman she had once been. The walls were closing in, and Nancy was beginning to realize just how much her daughter had concealed. And with each new revelation, the truth felt more and more unbearable. The weight of Detective Thompson's visit lingered long after he had left. Nancy stood by the window, staring out into the backyard, as the afternoon sun cast long shadows over the garden, but it felt as though the world outside had turned gray. The detective had promised they would continue their investigation, But the knowledge that they were now part of something far darker than they had ever imagined gnawed at her. The silence in the house was almost unbearable. Jada and Jalen sat side by side on the couch, their faces drawn with worry, yet their eyes still searching for reassurance, for comfort in the midst of so many unknowns. Nancy wanted to offer them something, anything to make them feel safe again, but the truth was she didn't feel safe herself. Her own daughter had been hiding a secret so terrible, so devastating, that it had shattered the very foundation of everything she had believed. Henry was in the kitchen, his face buried in his hands, though he didn't say a word. Nancy could hear him softly muttering to himself, as though trying to make sense of everything that had happened, as though trying to piece together the parts of a story that had never fully made sense to begin with. "Henry!" Nancy called softly from the hallway, her voice hesitant. He looked up, his eyes tired, but he nodded. "Yeah, Nancy? I think we need to talk," she said, her heart beating faster in her chest. She couldn't hold it in any longer. The truth was coming for them, whether they were ready or not. And there was no more pretending that everything was okay. He pushed away from the counter and walked toward her, his face drawn in worry. He had always been the protector in the family, the one who took charge when things went wrong. But now, she could see the cracks in his armor. The foundation he had built around his daughter's lies was crumbling, and he didn't know how to rebuild it. "About what happened to Michael," Nancy began, her words faltering. "Henry, Ruth, she's hiding something, and I don't think she's ever going to tell us the truth on her own." "I know," Henry murmured, the guilt in his voice so strong it made Nancy's stomach turn. "I've always protected her, Nancy. I knew she was an off, but I kept thinking it would get better. I didn't want to believe she could be capable of something like this. He stopped, his voice catching in his throat. "I never thought she could hurt him." Nancy walked over and placed a hand on his shoulder, trying to comfort him, though her own heart was heavy. "We have to face this, Henry. If we don't, then what happened to Michael? What happened to Ruth? It will keep hurting these kids. It will keep hurting us." He looked up at her, his face stricken with pain. "What do we do now?" Nancy took a deep breath. "We need to find Ruth. We need to know what really happened the night Michael disappeared. And no matter how much it hurts, we need to protect Jada and Jalen. They deserve the truth." Henry nodded, but there was a hesitation in his eyes, a fear of the truth, as if knowing it would be like opening a wound that could never heal. Just then, Jada's small voice broke through the tension. "Are we going to be okay?" she asked, looking up at Nancy, her eyes wide and full of fear. Nancy knelt down beside the couch, her heart aching for the girl who had already lost so much. "Of course, sweetheart. We're going to make sure you're safe. We'll make everything right." Jalen, who had been silently watching them, finally spoke up. "But where's Mom? Why did she leave us?" His voice trembled, and it was clear that the weight of what had happened was starting to settle on him as well. Nancy swallowed hard. How could she explain to them that their mother was the one responsible for the darkness in their lives? How could she put words to the horror of the situation when she still didn't fully understand it herself? "I don't know, Jalen," she said softly, her voice thick with emotion, "but we're going to find out, and I promise you we won't let her hurt you again." Jalen's lip trembled as he tried to hold back tears, but he didn't say anything more. Jada, on the other hand, buried her face in her hands and sobbed quietly. Nancy reached out and pulled both children into her arms, her heart breaking for them all over again. They had no idea the extent of their mother's betrayal, no idea how deeply she had hurt them, but Nancy did, and that knowledge weighed on her like a burden she couldn't bear. The next day, Nancy and Henry set out to find Ruth. They knew she wouldn't come willingly, that she would continue to hide behind her lies and deflections, but they had no choice. The police were investigating, but Nancy knew the truth wouldn't come out unless Ruth was confronted directly. They started by going to Ruth's apartment, a place they hadn't visited in years. It was an old run-down building on the outskirts of town, a far cry from the suburban life they had raised her to expect. Nancy had always known Ruth was struggling, but she had never imagined it had gotten this bad. The building's hallway smelled of stale air and neglect, and the buzz of fluorescent lights overhead made the atmosphere feel even more oppressive. As they reached Ruth's door, Henry hesitated. Nancy could see the anxiety written all over his face. "You don't have to do this," he said quietly. "We could just call the police again." "No," Nancy replied firmly, her eyes steely. "We need to hear it from her. We need to hear her say it." With a deep breath, she knocked on the door. There was no immediate answer. Nancy knocked again, louder this time, and then, after what felt like an eternity, the door creaked open just enough for Ruth to peek out. Her eyes were red-rimmed, and her hair was tangled, just like the last time they had seen her. "What do you want?" Ruth asked, her voice rough and defensive. "We need to talk," Nancy said quietly, her voice filled with a strength she didn't know she had. About Michael, about everything. Ruth's eyes flickered, and for a moment, it seemed like she might slam the door in their faces, but then something changed. Her gaze softened, and she stepped back, allowing them to enter. Inside, the apartment was dark and cluttered, with barely any furniture. The silence between them felt heavy, oppressive. Nancy and Henry exchanged a look before Nancy spoke again, her voice barely a whisper. "Ruth, what really happened that night? What happened to Michael?" Ruth's face hardened as she sank into an old chair, her eyes flickering between the two of them. For a long moment she said nothing. Then, in a voice so low it was almost a whisper, she finally spoke. "You wouldn't understand," Ruth said, her voice trembling. "I didn't want any of this to happen, but I couldn't stop it. I never could." Nancy's heart pounded in her chest, and she stepped closer. "Stop what, Ruth? Stop what?" Ruth closed her eyes, a pained expression crossing her face, and then, with a voice that was barely audible, she whispered the words Nancy had been dreading to hear. "I didn't kill him, but I might as well have." And in that moment everything changed. The truth was finally out, but it was far worse than anyone could have imagined. The room seemed to close in around Nancy. The words Ruth had spoken, "I didn't kill him, but I might as well have," reverberated in her mind, repeating over and over, like a mantra she couldn't escape. It was as if the air had been sucked out of the room, leaving only a heavy, suffocating silence. Nancy's heart pounded in her chest, and her palms felt slick with sweat. For a moment, no one moved. Ruth's eyes were cast downward, her hands twisted nervously in her lap, as though she were trying to keep some shred of control over the situation. Henry stood beside Nancy, his face pale as he absorbed the weight of his daughter's words. Nancy couldn't believe what she was hearing. Ruth, her own flesh and blood, had just admitted to something horrible, something that she hadn't been ready to face. Michael's death wasn't just a disappearance. It was a tragedy that Ruth had played a part in. "But how? Why?" "You have to explain, Ruth." Nancy's voice cracked as she took a step closer to her daughter. "What happened? What did you do?" Ruth looked up at her, her eyes wide with a mixture of guilt and fear. She opened her mouth to speak, but then paused, as though searching for the right words. Finally, she spoke in a voice that was barely above a whisper. "It wasn't supposed to go this far, Mom," she said, the tremble in her voice betraying her fragile composure. "I didn't want to hurt him, but I couldn't get out of it. I couldn't get away." Nancy's heart twisted. She wanted to scream, to demand answers, but all she could do was stand there, numb with shock. Ruth had been hiding so much, and now the pieces were starting to fall into place. The anger, the lies, the disintegration of their family, it all led to this moment. "Ruth," Henry's voice broke through the tension. "What did you mean? What happened to Michael? Tell us the truth." Ruth's eyes darted around the room as though she were looking for an escape, but there was nowhere to run. She was cornered, and the truth had finally caught up with her. He was involved with people," Ruth said, her voice barely audible now. "I thought he was changing. I thought we could start fresh, that we could leave all that behind, but he kept going back to them. The drugs, the dealers, the violence, it all came back, even though I begged him to stop." Nancy's stomach churned. Ruth had always painted Michael as a loving father, a man who was misunderstood but capable of redemption. The truth was so much darker than that. "He was dangerous, Mom," Ruth continued, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. "And I was afraid of what he might do to me, to the kids. One night he came home and he was different, angry. He said he was done with us. He was going to leave, but not before taking the kids with him. He got violent." Henry's face had turned ashen, his hands clenched into fists at his sides, but he remained silent, unable to process the words his daughter was saying. Nancy, too, was struggling to absorb the story unfolding in front of her. Ruth continued, her words pouring out in a rush now as if she could no longer contain the secrets she had been hiding. "I didn't know what to do. He was out of control. He started yelling, hitting things, and he said he would take the kids. And I couldn't let him. I couldn't. I tried to talk to him, to calm him down, but he wouldn't listen. He was too far gone, and that's when it happened." Nancy felt her heart stop. "What happened, Ruth?" she asked, her voice trembling. "What did you do?" Ruth's eyes closed, and for a long moment she didn't say anything. When she opened them again, her gaze was hollow, as if she had seen something that had shattered her. "I didn't mean to, but I pushed him just once. I didn't think it would. I didn't think he would fall like that. He hit his head. I didn't even realize it until he wasn't moving anymore." The confession hung in the air like a dense fog, suffocating everyone in the room. Nancy's mind spun with disbelief. Ruth had killed Michael. Not intentionally, but by her actions, By pushing him in a moment of fear and desperation, she had taken his life. Henry staggered back, his hand gripping the wall as though he might collapse at any moment. He hadn't said a word since Ruth's confession. It was too much. He had always protected Ruth, always seen the best in her, even when the signs were there, even when everyone around him was warning him. But now, the full truth of what had happened was laid bare. "Ruth," Nancy said, her voice filled with anguish. A voice, "Why didn't you tell us? Why didn't you come to us for help?" Ruth's face crumpled as she sank further into the chair. "I couldn't. I was terrified. I didn't want anyone to know. I thought if I kept it a secret, it would go away, that I could fix it on my own, but I couldn't. I couldn't fix anything." Her voice cracked with raw emotion. "I left him there and I took the kids and ran. I thought if I just disappeared, no one would know what really happened." Nancy felt her knees weaken. She had always known Ruth was troubled, but she had never imagined this. Never imagined that her daughter's fear and desperation had led her to this horrific outcome. And now there was no going back. Ruth had killed Michael, and in doing so had left her children in a world of chaos and pain. She had abandoned them, never giving them the opportunity to mourn their father, never allowing them to heal. "I thought I was protecting them," Ruth whispered, "but I wasn't. I failed them. I failed Michael. I failed everyone." Nancy could feel her anger rising, but more than that, she felt something deeper, a hollow sadness that stretched all the way to her core. This wasn't just about Michael's death. It was about the life that Ruth had destroyed, the choices she had made that had led to this point. And now the consequences would fall on the shoulders of those who had the least power, Jada and Jalen. Henry was still standing there, motionless, as if frozen in place. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he spoke, his voice low and broken. "I protected you, Ruth. I kept telling myself you would come through, that you would be the one to make things right, but now I don't know what to do anymore." Ruth's eyes filled with tears, and she looked at her father, her expression pleading. "I didn't want this, Dad. I never wanted this, but I was so afraid, so scared that I'd lose everything." Nancy watched her daughter crumble, but there was no forgiveness in her heart. Not yet, not with the weight of what had been done, and there was no more pretending, no more running from the truth. Nancy turned toward the door. "We're calling the police," she said firmly. "It's time to stop hiding." As they left the apartment, Ruth's soft cries echoed behind them. But there was no comfort to be found. Not for her, not for anyone. The truth had come out, and it was too late to change what had been done. The drive back home was a blur of emotions. Nancy sat in the passenger seat, staring out the window as the suburban streets of Atlanta blurred past her. The weight of what Ruth had admitted, the brutal reality of Michael's death, pressed down on her chest, leaving her breathless. Henry was silent beside her, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles were white. She could feel the tension in the car, thick and suffocating. They both knew that what had happened was irreversible. Ruth's confession, though it came from a place of fear and desperation, didn't change the fact that Michael was dead, that he had died in a way that no one had ever expected, that Ruth, their daughter, had killed him, not intentionally, but out of her own helplessness and fear. And now, the children, their grandchildren, were caught in the aftermath. Jada and Jalen had witnessed the unraveling of their family, their world shattered by their mother's actions. They had been abandoned, left to navigate a world full of lies and confusion. Nancy's heart broke for them. The pain they must have felt, the fear they carried, she could hardly bear it. How could Ruth have done this to them? How could she have abandoned her children, leaving them to fend for themselves, only to come back later and demand they return to the chaos she had created? "Henry." Nancy's voice was quiet, but it held a weight of sorrow. "We can't let her take them back. We can't." Henry didn't reply, but Nancy could see the struggle in his face. He had spent his life trying to protect his children, trying to shield them from the ugliness of the world, but now, with the truth laid bare, there was no more protection left. Ruth had created this mess, and now they had to deal with the consequences. When they arrived back at the house, Jada and Jalen were sitting on the couch, their eyes hollow, faces pale. They had been waiting for them, not speaking, not moving, just staring at the door as if expecting it to open, expecting something to change. But the reality was sinking in for them, too. Their mother wasn't coming to save them. Nancy and Henry exchanged a glance before stepping inside. The house felt different now, heavier, colder, as though the air itself had been changed by the truth. "We need to talk," Nancy said softly, her voice breaking through the silence. She turned to the children. "Jada, Jalen, I need you to listen carefully, okay?" The children both looked up at her, their eyes filled with confusion, their faces streaked with the remnants of tears they had yet to shed. They didn't know the whole truth, not yet, But Nancy could see the questions in their eyes, the silent plea for answers. "Your mother." Nancy paused, her heart catching in her throat as she tried to find the words. "Your mother didn't just leave you, Nancy swallowed hard. "She hurt your father. Michael is gone, and we're going to have to face that too." Jalen's eyes widened in disbelief, his face scrunching up in pain. "What do you mean? What happened to Dad?" Nancy closed her eyes for a moment, fighting the lump in her throat. She hadn't wanted to say it like this. She hadn't wanted to be the one to destroy their innocence. But the time had come. "Your mom, she didn't mean to, but she pushed him. And when he fell, he hit his head. It wasn't on purpose, but he died because of it." The words hung heavy in the air, and for a long moment there was only silence. Jada, who had been so quiet up until now, suddenly burst into tears, her small body shaking with sobs. Jalen's face went pale as he turned away from her, his fists clenched at his sides, as though the news had hit him harder than he could express. Nancy knelt down in front of them, her heart breaking as she tried to comfort them. She wanted to say something, anything that would make it better, but she knew there were no words that could undo what had happened. "I'm so sorry," Nancy whispered, pulling both children into her arms. "I know this is too much, but you need to know the truth, and we're going to take care of you. We're going to make sure you're okay." Henry stood in the doorway, watching the scene unfold. His hands were trembling, but he didn't move. He wasn't sure what to say, how to console his grandchildren, how to offer them anything when the truth was so ugly, so raw. Jada pulled away from Nancy, her face a mixture of anger and confusion. "Why didn't you help us sooner?" she asked, her voice trembling with emotion. "Why didn't you stop her from hurting Dad?" Nancy's heart broke for her. "We didn't know, sweetheart. We didn't know what was really happening. We thought your mom was okay, but now we know the truth and we're going to protect you from here on out." Jalen looked up at her, his expression more confused than angry. "What happens now? What happens to us?" Nancy wiped the tears from her own eyes as she looked at him. She didn't have all the answers. She didn't know how to fix everything, but she knew one thing for sure. They would not let Ruth tear them apart any further. "We're going to figure it out, Jalen," she said firmly. "You're going to stay here with us. We're going to take care of you no matter what happens." Henry finally stepped forward, his voice thick with emotion. "And we're going to make sure your mum doesn't hurt you again. I promise you that." Later that evening, after the children had gone to bed, Nancy and Henry sat together in the living room, the weight of the day pressing down on them. The house was eerily quiet, the only sound the ticking of the clock on the wall. They had done all they could for the moment, but they both knew the real work had just begun. Ruth was out there somewhere, still hiding from the consequences of her actions, and they had to figure out what to do next. "We can't let her take them, Henry," Nancy said quietly, her voice heavy with determination. "We can't let her hurt them again." "I know," Henry whispered, his face filled with guilt and fear. "But she's their mother. How do we stop her?" "We'll figure it out," Nancy replied, though she wasn't sure how. "We'll go to the police. We'll make sure Jada and Jalen are protected. Ruth isn't getting them back." They sat in silence for a moment, each of them lost in their thoughts. Nancy felt a strange sense of peace settle over her. There would be difficult days ahead, difficult conversations with the authorities, with Ruth, and with the children, but at least now they knew the truth. And that, somehow, was the first step toward healing. The past was never going to be forgotten. The hurt, the betrayal, and the loss, they would never go away. But Nancy knew they would face the future together, as a family, and that was what mattered most. They weren't alone anymore, and as long as they stuck together, they could survive anything. The morning after their conversation, the weight of the truth hung heavy in the air. The house felt smaller now, the walls pressing in as if bearing witness to everything that had unfolded. Ruth's confession still echoed in Nancy's mind, the reality of it settling deeper with each passing hour. The children had gone to bed early the night before, exhausted from the emotional roller coaster that had rocked their world. Nancy had hoped that sleep would offer them some peace, but she knew that today would be another painful step in the journey toward healing. Nancy stood at the kitchen counter, absent-mindedly stirring coffee as Henry sat at the table, his hands folded in front of him. The morning sun filtered in through the window, casting soft rays across the room, but it didn't seem to soften the tension that lingered between them. "Do you think Ruth will try again?" Henry's voice was low, thick with uncertainty. Nancy didn't answer immediately. The truth was, she wasn't sure what Ruth would do next. After the confession, after the revelation of Michael's death, Nancy couldn't predict how far her daughter would go to regain control over the children, or if she even cared about them anymore. Ruth's actions had already proven that her own fear and desperation had outweighed any sense of maternal love she might have once had. "I don't know," Nancy said softly, her mind racing. But we have to be prepared. We have to make sure Jada and Jalen are safe. Ruth might not stop, Henry. Not until she gets what she wants. Henry ran a hand through his graying hair, his face a portrait of regret. I should have seen it. I should have known. But I couldn't. I couldn't bring myself to believe it. I kept making excuses for her. I kept hoping she would change. Nancy reached out and placed her hand gently on his. I know you did, but we can't change the past. All we can do is move forward. We need to protect them now. Their conversation was interrupted by a soft knock on the door. The sound was jarring in the stillness, a reminder that their lives had been irrevocably changed. Nancy exchanged a look with Henry before walking toward the door, her heart hammering in her chest. Who could it be? When she opened it, her breath caught. Standing on the porch was Detective Thompson, his face unreadable, his posture tense. He was holding a folder in his hand, and his eyes were fixed on her with a look of seriousness that made Nancy's stomach churn. Detective, what's going on? Nancy asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I need to speak with you and your husband, Thompson replied, his tone grim. It's about Ruth. Nancy stepped aside, motioning for him to come in. As he crossed the threshold, she could feel the gravity of the situation. Henry joined them in the living room, his expression a mixture of apprehension and curiosity. What's happened? Henry asked, his voice thick with concern. Thompson sat down, opening the folder he was holding. He slid a few photos across the table toward them. Nancy's breath hitched when she saw what was printed on them. Photos of Ruth. But these weren't the photos of the woman she had known. These were different. These were taken yesterday afternoon, Detective Thompson said, his voice low. Ruth was spotted near a known drug house, one that we've been investigating for some time. She was seen talking to one of the dealers. We believe she's been involved with the same people that Michael was connected to. She's not just hiding the truth about his death. She's still involved in the mess that got him killed. Nancy's blood ran cold. The pieces were starting to fall into place in a way she hadn't anticipated. Ruth wasn't just a broken woman trying to protect her family. She had been actively involved in the same dark world that had swallowed Michael whole. Is she still in contact with them? Henry asked, his voice shaking with disbelief. Thompson nodded. We believe she is, and we've been tracking her. It's clear now that she's been trying to cover her tracks, not just for what happened to Michael, but for the activities she's been involved in herself. We need to bring her in for questioning, but there's something else. Nancy's heart raced. What else? Thompson's eyes met hers, and there was a brief pause before he spoke. Ruth has been trying to make contact with the children. We've intercepted a few of her messages, and we know she's planning to come for them. She doesn't want anyone to know she's involved in this. She thinks she can still get away with it. But we can't let that happen. Henry stood up abruptly, his anger simmering just below the surface. She can't take them. She can't hurt them again. We're going to make sure she doesn't, Thompson reassured them. But we need your help. You need to keep the children here. Don't let Ruth have any contact with them. We're going to put a protective detail in place, but we can't take any chances. This is bigger than we thought. Nancy's mind raced as she processed everything the detective had said. Ruth was more dangerous than they had realized. She wasn't just a broken woman grieving the loss of her family. She was still tied to the very forces that had destroyed their lives. And now she was coming after Jada and Jalen, determined to drag them back into the chaos. We'll do whatever it takes to protect them, Nancy said, her voice firm. We won't let her hurt them again. The rest of the day passed in a blur of preparations. Detective Thompson arranged for a team to monitor Ruth's movements, and he reassured Nancy and Henry that they would be doing everything in their power to keep Jada and Jalen safe. The children were kept in the house, away from any potential danger, and Nancy found herself constantly watching the windows, as if expecting Ruth to appear at any moment. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Nancy and Henry sat together in the living room, the house eerily quiet. The children were upstairs, asleep, or at least Nancy hoped they were. The house had never felt so empty, so fragile. We have to stay strong for them, Nancy said, her voice low but resolute. They need us. We can't let Ruth tear apart what little we've built for them. Henry nodded, his eyes heavy with exhaustion. I know, but it's hard, Nancy. I keep thinking about how much we've lost. We should have known, we should have done more. Nancy reached over and took his hand, her grip tight. We can't change the past, Henry, but we can protect them now. We can keep them safe, and we'll help them heal. For a long moment, they sat in silence, the weight of their conversation settling between them. They didn't know what the future held, whether Ruth would try to take the children, or if the truth would tear their family apart further. But in that moment, they had each other. And for Nancy, that was enough. The road ahead would be difficult, but they were ready to face it together. The days that followed were a blur of tension, uncertainty, and constant vigilance. Nancy and Henry kept a careful watch over Jada and Jalen, doing everything they could to shield them from the fallout of Ruth's actions. Every time the phone rang or someone knocked on the door, Nancy's heart would race, fearing it might be Ruth, showing up with more lies or worse, a plan to take the children away. Despite their precautions, Ruth was never far from their minds. Detective Thompson had promised that his team would monitor her movements, but the uncertainty of what Ruth might do next weighed heavily on them. The idea that their daughter, the woman they had raised, was willing to destroy her own children to cover up her crimes, haunted Nancy every moment. It was late in the evening when Nancy first heard the unmistakable sound of the doorbell ringing. Sharp and urgent, the house, which had been so quiet, seemed to stand still at the sound. Henry was at the table trying to read the newspaper, but the lines blurred before his eyes as the same fear that gripped Nancy took hold of him. Nancy glanced at him, and he rose slowly, his face pale. "It's too late for anyone to be visiting." "I know," Nancy said, her voice barely a whisper. She had the sudden, sinking feeling that they were being watched, that Ruth had somehow found them. The doorbell rang again, louder this time, demanding attention. Nancy's heart hammered in her chest as she walked toward the door. She didn't know whether to expect Ruth, a stranger, or the police, but her steps were heavy with dread. When Nancy opened the door, her breath caught in her throat. Standing there was Detective Thompson, his expression grim, and behind him was another officer holding a stack of paperwork. "Detective Thompson!" Nancy's voice cracked. "What's going on?" Thompson's eyes were filled with concern as he stepped inside, followed by the second officer. "We need to talk," he said quietly. "It's about Ruth." Nancy's stomach twisted into knots. She stepped aside to let him in, but her eyes never left his face. Henry was already on his feet, moving toward them. "What happened? Is she here?" Henry's voice held a thread of panic. Thompson's face remained somber. "No, but she's been in contact with someone, a person from her past, someone she used to associate with. We've traced her communications, and it seems she's planning something. We're not sure what, but we can't take any chances. That's why we need to act fast." Nancy felt her pulse quicken. "What are you saying? What should we do?" "We need to keep the children here, and we need to make sure Ruth can't get to them," Thompson said, his voice low but firm. "We've already started an investigation into the people she's been in touch with, but it's clear she's trying to cover her tracks. We believe she's planning to take the children away, possibly out of state, possibly to another part of the city. We don't know how far she's willing to go to keep her secrets hidden." Henry's face paled as he turned to Nancy. "She's coming for them again. She's not done." Nancy could feel the fury rising in her chest, but she kept it in check. The reality of what had happened, of what Ruth had done, still felt unreal, like a nightmare she couldn't wake from. "Do we have time?" Nancy asked, "and can we stop her?" "We'll do everything we can," Thompson said, "but you need to be prepared. Keep the children inside. Don't let them leave this house. If Ruth shows up, we'll be ready. But we don't know when or where she'll strike." Nancy nodded, her mind racing. She turned toward the stairs, toward the children's rooms, but something stopped her. A sudden, painful realization washed over her. She couldn't shield them from this forever. The truth was too big, too painful, and they had already lost so much. But now, with Ruth lurking in the shadows, there was no way to protect them from the full force of what had happened. Nancy's voice broke the silence. "What do we tell them?" Thompson hesitated. "Tell them that their mother's not coming back. Tell them that you're here to protect them, that they're safe. But don't lie to them. Don't say anything that isn't true. They deserve to know what's going on, and they deserve to know the truth." Nancy didn't answer immediately. How could she tell them everything? How could she break their hearts even more than they already had been? But the detective was right. They deserved to know. "Okay," Nancy said quietly, the weight of the decision settling over her like a heavy blanket. She glanced back at Henry. "We'll tell them." Later that evening, after the children had gone to bed, Nancy and Henry sat together in the living room, exhausted but resolute. The house felt like a fortress, secure for now, but fragile, vulnerable to the forces outside that threatened to tear it apart. "We have to make sure they know we're not leaving them," Nancy said, her voice strong despite the weariness in her bones. "We have to be their safe place." Henry nodded, his face grim. "I don't know how we're going to do this, Nancy, but we have to." They were interrupted by a soft knock at the door, and both of them froze. There was no mistaking it. The knock was too light, too tentative. It wasn't the firm, urgent knock of an official visitor or the desperate pound of someone in need. This was different. Nancy and Henry exchanged a glance. Without a word, they both knew who it had to be. "I'll go," Henry said, standing up, but Nancy stopped him, placing a hand on his arm. "No, I'll go." She moved toward the door, her pulse racing. This was it. Ruth had come to finish what she had started. When she opened the door, There stood Ruth, her face pale and drawn, eyes wide with something, fear, desperation, or perhaps both. She looked smaller than Nancy had remembered, like someone who had been crushed by the weight of her own decisions. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Ruth's voice was shaky, barely audible. "Mom, Dad, I need help. I can't fix this. I don't know what to do anymore." The words that Nancy had prepared for this moment stuck in her throat. What was she supposed to say? What could she say after everything Ruth had done? "Ruth," Nancy started, her voice breaking, "you've already made your choices. You've hurt so many people. And now you want us to fix it? You want to take them back after everything, after Michael is dead, after you abandoned them?" Ruth's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't speak, her face crumpling under the weight of Nancy's words. "No, Ruth," Nancy said, shaking her head. "This is over. You can't have them back. Not after everything." And as she stood there facing her daughter, her broken, lost daughter, the truth finally hit her. There was no going back. Ruth had made her choices, and now there was nothing left but to protect the children, no matter what it cost. "Go," Nancy said, her voice steady now. "Leave and don't come back." The door closed with a soft click, and Ruth was gone. But Nancy knew this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning of a new chapter for their family, and this time they were ready. The next few days felt like a strange kind of limbo, quiet, suspended between the chaos of the past and the uncertain future that lay ahead. Nancy and Henry knew the worst was over in one sense. Ruth had finally been forced to step away, but the damage had already been done. Jada and Jalen had lost their mother. They had lost their father, even if they didn't fully understand how or why. And now they were left in the hands of their grandparents. Two people who had spent their lives trying to protect their children and grandchildren, but had failed in ways they could never take back. The truth of it all sat heavily with Nancy. She couldn't change what had happened, couldn't undo the destruction Ruth had caused. All she could do now was move forward, one step at a time, and give Jada and Jalen the one thing she knew they needed most: love, safety, and truth. It wouldn't be easy. It would take time, but they would heal together. It was a Friday afternoon when Nancy decided it was time to sit down with the children and talk. She had hoped to wait a little longer, to shield them from the pain for just a bit longer, but the silence between them had become too heavy, and she knew they deserved to hear it all. The full truth, no matter how hard it was to say. She found Jada and Jalen sitting on the couch in the living room, both of them staring at the TV but not really watching it. The emptiness in their eyes made Nancy's heart ache. She walked over and sat down beside them, her hands resting gently on their shoulders. They looked at her, their faces tired and wary, like they were waiting for the next wave of bad news. "I need to talk to you both," Nancy began softly, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "There are things you need to know about what happened, about your mom and dad and why things turned out the way they did." Jalen shifted uncomfortably, looking down at his hands. Jada, always more reserved, hugged her knees to her chest, her eyes trained on the floor. Nancy felt a pang in her chest but pressed on. "I know this has been hard," Nancy continued, her voice trembling slightly, "and I know you both have a lot of questions. You've lost so much already and it's not fair, but I want to make sure you know the truth, the whole truth." Jada finally looked up, her eyes filled with sorrow and confusion. "What do you mean, Grandma? What happened to Dad? What happened to Mom?" Nancy swallowed hard, fighting the lump in her throat. She had known this moment was coming, but she hadn't expected it to feel this heavy, this impossible. She looked at Henry, who had been quietly standing at the doorway, watching them. He stepped forward now and sat next to Nancy, his presence a quiet strength. "Your mum, Ruth," Henry said gently. "She made some really bad choices. She was caught up in things that hurt her and hurt all of us. She kept hiding the truth from everyone, about Dad, about what happened to him." He paused, his voice faltering as he continued. "We didn't know, but she pushed him, and when he fell he hit his head, and that was it. He died." Jalen's eyes widened, his hands gripping the couch as if he could steady himself against the shock of the words. Jada's face remained a mask, her expression unreadable, but Nancy could see the pain in her eyes, the quiet devastation that she was trying so hard to suppress. "It wasn't your fault," Nancy added quickly, her heart breaking for them both. "You didn't do anything wrong. Your mum, she was scared, and she made terrible choices, but it wasn't your fault." The silence that followed felt suffocating. The weight of the truth was too much for any of them to carry, but Nancy knew that they had to, for their own healing, for their own peace. They needed to understand that their lives, as shattered as they were, could still be rebuilt. "Why didn't she come back for us sooner?" Jada whispered, her voice raw with emotion. "Why did she leave us like that?" Nancy pulled both children into her arms, wrapping them tightly in the safety of her embrace. "I don't know, sweetheart," she said softly. "I wish I had the answers. But I can tell you this. She wasn't strong enough to be the mother you needed. She couldn't protect you the way I'm going to. You're safe now. You're with us." Jada let out a quiet sob, and Jalen wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. The pain they were feeling was too much for words, and yet Nancy knew this was the moment of catharsis they all needed. The weight of their past had to be acknowledged before they could move forward. The tears didn't stop immediately, but they weren't the same kind of tears they had been crying for so long. They were the kind of tears that came when the truth had finally been spoken, when the facade was shattered, and the long, dark tunnel finally had a glimmer of light at the end. The days that followed were a slow process of healing, both for Nancy and Henry, and for Jada and Jalen. They spent time together, doing small things to begin rebuilding their family. They cooked meals together, played board games, and tried to fill the house with laughter again. But it wasn't always easy. There were moments of silence, moments when the pain of the past would resurface. But Nancy kept reminding them that they were a family, and families, no matter how broken, could heal. Detective Thompson had kept his promise. Ruth's attempts to contact the children had stopped. There were no more late-night knocks on the door, no more desperate phone calls. The police were watching her, and while Nancy didn't know what the future held for Ruth, she knew one thing for certain. Ruth would never again have the power to hurt her children. Nancy and Henry had made the decision to legally adopt Jada and Jalen, to make sure they had a permanent legal place in their lives. It was the final step in forging a future for their family, a future where Ruth no longer had any hold over them. The paperwork was still being processed, but it felt like the last piece of the puzzle was falling into place. One evening, as they sat together on the porch watching the sunset, Jada leaned her head on Nancy's shoulder, and Jalen sat beside Henry. The quiet between them was no longer filled with tension. There was a peacefulness in the air, a sense of belonging that Nancy hadn't felt in a long time. "We're going to be okay, aren't we, Grandma?" Jada asked softly, her voice full of quiet hope. Nancy kissed the top of her head and smiled through her own tears. "Yes, sweetheart, we'll be okay, together." As the sun dipped below the horizon, Nancy knew that their journey wasn't over. There would still be days when the past would try to break through, days when the weight of what they had endured would feel too much. But for now, they were together. And together they would rebuild. Together they would heal, and that was enough.
Hope you enjoyed the story. Comment where you're watching from, leave a like, and subscribe to the channel.